Labour's shadow Treasury team wants to make the positive case that membership of the EU is in the best interests of the future generations of our country. I want to thank the TUC as well for hosting me here today. I used to work for the TUC many years ago. I think I've still left my Liverpool mug here somewhere. One of the lesser-known things about the TUC is the relationships they maintain with other trade unions across Europe and the rest of the world. It's helped connect millions of working people across numerous countries to find shared solutions to complex problems that affect the lives of so many, and regardless of borders or national flags. It was this culture of solidarity and unity that the trade union movement spread throughout Europe long before the EU existed, that helped to create the post-war environment that led to its creation. In just over a month from now, our country will make one of the biggest decisions it's faced in a generation. And in campaigning on this issue, on the doorstep, the first thing I've heard when discussing the EU referendum is the level of debate so far has been extremely negative, to be frank, on both sides. And that what people want, they tell me on the doorstep, are the facts, and actually some real vision from politicians. And to be frank, I think they're right. The referendum has resulted from splits in the Conservative Party and their fear of UKIP. And as a result, I think the debate's degenerated into the worst form of negativity and brought out the worst in Westminster politics. And the negativity has been overwhelming at times. Some of the things that have been brought up, the World War III could break out. People will be fired from their jobs. Boris Johnson could be Prime Minister. And families could be divided forever. And that's just what it means to the Conservative Party. I want us all to try and rescue this debate now from this negativity and project fear coming from all sides of the Tory party at the moment. It's time to turn this debate around, drive out the politics of despair, and offer a vision for Britain and Europe. One where we protect workers' rights, tackle tax avoidance, get to grips with climate change, and protect our industries, like the steel industry, as we've tried so hard recently. This is a vision of Europe based upon hope and solidarity. But just let me turn to the at least two facts that people have been asking for. There are two basic facts I just want to point to today, especially to Labour voters and our supporters. With global economic uncertainties combined with Tory economic incompetence, from budgets they can't make add up to fiscal targets that they can't achieve, the risk of an immediate economic fallout from Tory Brexit, to be frank, and those advocating, the risk of immediate economic Tory Brexit means that those advocating a Labour vote to leave carry a heavy responsibility. Labour voters who are voting for Brexit need to know what could be on the cards if we leave right now. So fact one is the economic reality, as pointed out by what the IMF said last week, that in the event of a Brexit, and I quote, plans for additional medium-term budget consolidation may need to be developed to offset the longer-run adverse fiscal effects. In plain English, if we have a Tory Brexit, then we have the likelihood of more Tory cuts to come. As we all know what that means under a Tory Treasury, more austerity cuts just to meet their inflexible or flawed fiscal targets. George Osborne has already created a 4.8 billion black hole in the nation's finances. And thanks to George, the recovery is built on sand, and our economy today is not strong enough to withstand the kind of shock, adverse shock, that Brexit could create. That's the first fact I think people need to take into account. Fact two, to be frank, for Labour supporters and Labour voters who might be tempted to be voting for Brexit, is that it will be a Tory government still in power the day after the referendum. And it'll be a Tory government pushing austerity, committed to cutting first and thinking later, just as they've done so far. And with the economy pushed into recession by Brexit, as the Bank of England predicts, the immediate future could look grim. And it's not worth considering a Tory Brexit when a Labour Remain vote offers a truly positive economic case. But I don't want to focus on the negatives today. I want to speak today about the alternative vision for Europe. I know that for some people, hearing me making a positive case for Remain in Europe may be surprising. And I know there are some people who are trying to say deep down, I don't really support the vote to remain, or that my heart's not in it. Let me be absolutely clear to you. I'll be voting to remain in the EU on the 23rd of June, and I'll be campaigning for a Labour in vote from now until polling day. Just to demonstrate how committed I am, after my speech today, I'm even doing an event with Peter Mandelson, so please don't question my commitment to winning this campaign. But I do draw the line at sharing a platform with Tories on this issue. Let me be absolutely clear. The Tories are the main enemy of working people in this country. It's not the EU, it's the Tories. And that's why I'm opposed to Tory Brexit. Let's be under no illusion that leaving the EU under a Tory government is what's on offer in the immediate aftermath of a Leave vote on the 23rd of June. Anyway, we should lift our sights. There's a need for us to offer a vision of a Europe of cooperation and solidarity. Instead of the Tory politics of fear, we need to offer Labour's politics of hope. So let me set out the vision of Europe I have and the issues we as Europeans need to tackle together. We know that there are pressing issues facing us that can only be tackled effectively through international cooperation. Creating a prosperous economy where prosperity is shared fairly by all is one. Ensuring basic rights at work where everyone chooses to work. Tackling climate change. Dealing with international humanitarian crises, especially where refugees are created. The EU, with all its imperfections, provides us with that forum not just for securing that international cooperation, but also translating it into effective action. Let me just turn to creating that fair and prosperous economy. One of the cornerstones of a prosperous and fair economy is a fair taxation system. The shocking scale of tax evasion and avoidance has been exposed by the recent Panama leaks. On this issue, the contrast between the Tory politics of fear and Labour's politics of hope has been made bitterly clear over the last few months. Tory MEPs voted again and again and again against measures at the EU level to clamp down on obscene levels of tax avoidance. When bankers' bonuses were threatened with a clampdown by the EU, George Osborne dispatched an army of lawyers to fight the case for the bankers. Contrast that with Labour MEPs. They've been fighting hard in the European Parliament for real action against those, whether the super rich or major corporations, who try to duck their responsibilities to society. They've helped draw up EU-wide measures brought in the aftermath of the LuxLeaks scandal and pushed for full public country-by-country reporting of multinational companies' accounts right across the EU. So there's a lot we can do on tax evasion and avoidance here at home. But because avoiders exploit the differences in different tax systems, the most effective action is collective action internationally. And that's why EU-wide action on evasion and avoidance matters. The EU has been too slack on this before, admittedly, but together with progressive parties across the continent, Labour is pushing for a clampdown on the corrosive effects of tax avoidance. Part of Labour's vision is to see fairness in tax systems, not just here, but across the whole continent. Working people everywhere suffer when those who could and should pay their taxes choose not to. Let me just turn to industrial policy and investment. We all want a better, fairer economy that works in the interests of the great majority. Collaboration across borders on employment rights, industrial policy and investment is an essential part of achieving that. Due to so many fear stories on both sides of the EU referendum debate, the positive things that the EU supports which help working people can get missed. So just let's remind ourselves, the exemplifications we've made time and time again, 4 weeks paid holiday entitlement, the right to maternity leave, protection on how many hours we work, and improved rights for agency workers, secured across Europe. All things won by the workers' movement that the EU now helps protect, and all the things the Tories and UKIP want to tear up. The EU also currently provides huge levels of funding to businesses, universities, schools and local authorities in Britain, and at preferential rates. Again, not largely reported. The EU's European Investment Bank is lending money to organisations at a cheaper rate than the UK government can. And this is because the bank has a AAA credit rating, whilst the George Osborne, as Chancellor, has seen the UK's credit rating downgraded. Last year alone, the UK received £5.6 billion from the EIB to help to regenerate communities and invest in infrastructure up and down this country. The Tories have consistently blocked a national investment bank for Britain that might be able to supply the investment our communities and industries, particularly outside of London, so urgently need. So with a Tory Chancellor committed to actually cutting investment, that EIB funding represents a lifeline to many of our regions and communities. And when faced with the dumping of Chinese steel onto European markets at prices that undercut the UK steel workers, it was the EU, not the UK government, that proposed new tariffs on Chinese steel. Instead, David Cameron's party were the ones who blocked it from happening. The EU proposed a workable, solid, continent-wide action plan on steel before the crisis well and truly blew up last year, and this was blocked by the Tories. Labour will stand up for the rights of workers and communities in Europe. Alongside our European partners, we'll take on the arguments about state aid where we have to. And we don't agree with using EU rules as an excuse to block progressive measures where necessary. Too often, the Treasury and the Tories have used state aid as an excuse for inaction. Other countries don't behave like this, whether it's the French government supporting their steel industry or the German government supporting theirs. But we believe in partnership and learning from each other. So I'll be visiting Germany next month to see how they are driving ahead with a 21st century energy policy, with taking local communities, taking ownership of renewable electricity generation. And Germany has set itself an ambitious target of 100% renewable energy production by 2050. That's the sort of target we could be emulating and learning from them. Local ownership of renewables with the benefits flowing directly back to communities is a critical part of our plan to get there. Local ownership is happening already so far on a smaller scale in Britain. Visionary councils like Preston in Lancashire are starting to think creatively about how their communities can make better and fairer use of the wealth they produce. In Preston, this has meant looking to support workers' cooperatives and working with major employers to support the local economy through better focused procurement. And it's now being backed by the EU, with Preston Council winning funding to support a network of forward-thinking local authorities across the continent. I want to take on the issue of migration. One of the fundamental rights of the EU to protect, I think, in the future, is for its citizens to protect this freedom of movement. I think this is absolutely critical. The right of working people to live and work where they choose is a hard-won gain of the labour movement. Last Wednesday morning, the former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Ian Duncan-Smith, claimed that EU immigration was hitting the low-paid almost as though the previous 6 years of his time in office had not taken place. I don't think Labour voters will be fooled by his crocodile tears and creative compassion. He has tried to claim that he has the interests of the most vulnerable in our society at heart while he campaigns for Brexit, and I don't believe him for a second. This is the Secretary of State who supported cuts to the disabled, cuts in in-work benefits, and introduced the bedroom tax. But it's not migrants that have been responsible for the attacks on the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. It's actually been Ian Duncan-Smith himself and the Tory party. It's interesting, though, by Thursday morning, a report from the London School of Economics came out to completely destroy his argument. The researchers stated that the fall in wages since 2008 was due to the global financial crisis and subsequent recession. It blew apart completely the anti-migrant arguments used by some of those who are campaigning for Brexit. The stress on the NHS and our school system is not due to increased migration, it's due to Tory austerity. It's the Tories who've enacted a top-down reorganisation of our NHS, not Bulgarian nurses. It's the Tory cuts to our schools budget, not Romanian teachers in our schools. It's not the fault of Polish fruit pickers or Latvian care workers that house building is at its lowest in peacetime history since the 1920s. It's the Tory failure to build more homes. We don't blame the people who work in our public services and make such a valuable contribution to our economy and society for the state of those public services. And we won't give an inch to the anti-migrant rubbish of some of those campaigning for Brexit. Blame for the state of our public services, rising inequality and a shaky economy should and squarely be laid at the door of the people responsible, number 10 and number 11 Downing Street. The Tories, I think, have been captured by UKIP, and we cannot let our country be captured by them too. There's been too much divisive talk about migration in this debate, and it's time to tackle these arguments head on. The honest, straightforward truth is that our country needs immigration, and that rather than costing us money, most migrants contribute more than they take. HMRC last week produced figures showing that recently arrived EA nationals paid $3 billion in taxes, yet claimed only $0.5 billion in benefits. Migration helps sections of our economy too, like construction. This is a vital part of our economy that should be driving ahead if we're to tackle our housing crisis. Oxford Economics has said that around 60% of construction firms have experienced hiring shortages of skilled labour in the last 12 months, compared with only 4% in 2013. One survey by the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors found that 27,000 construction projects could be impacted by the current shortage of workers by 2019, and that 66% of firms have turned work away as a result. Only last week we saw that the construction section is still struggling to recover from the 2008 downturn. Tory Brexit could and will make this worse if it happens. Obviously, some local communities will be affected by a sudden increase in local immigration. I should know that. I'm the MP for Heathrow Airport. But that's why Labour has advocated for a rapid migration fund to mitigate the overspills of immigration that can hit local services badly. If you have a rapid increase in immigration locally, you need an injection of funding. Instead, many councils are finding themselves with massive spending cuts. So the honest, straightforward truth is that our country also still has control of its borders. I'll just give the examples. The most recent figures show that 1,700 EU nationals were refused entry at UK ports last year. The British government removed a further 3,765 EU nationals, with an additional 714 who voluntarily left. The Tory Brexiters need to answer, if that's not enough, then how many must be removed? At what point would they be happy with these removals? And the Tories for Brexit need to answer, if tens of thousands are not enough, then how many and at what cost to the Chancellor's fiscal plans they voted for in March? The Conservative manifesto expressed an ambition to deliver annual net migration in the tens of thousands. However, according to the OBR supplementary document to the budget in March, the lowest forecast for inward net migration is 105,000, which clearly breaches the Conservative manifesto. Furthermore, the OBR forecast that such inward migration would see a budget surplus of $6.1 billion in 2019-20, suggesting that the Chancellor will miss his $10 billion surplus unless he abandons his manifesto commitment. Therefore, we're in this absurd situation whereby a Chancellor can only keep his target by breaking a manifesto commitment. And the equally absurd position of Tory cabinet ministers supporting the Chancellor's budget while calling for a Brexit under the guise of curbing immigration. But those curbs would literally shred Osborne's budget calculations to pieces, as the official forecasts show. But those who wish to remain in Cabinet but not in the EU also lack credibility on this issue. So when a member of the Cabinet, like John Whittingdale, claims the UK, quote, is creaking at the seams, he can't have it both ways. Which does he support, the immigration target or the £10 billion surplus target? The truth is that, like his budget built on failure, the Tories' rhetoric on immigration does not match the realities of their economics. We should stand foursquare for freedom of movement in Europe. The right to travel and seek employment is a fundamental one, and this is a Europe of freedom and hope, not barbed wire fences and fear. On free movement, it's the next generation who will most benefit from a closer relationship with the EU and our own country. People of my generation have a very different view of Europe than those of our children. Many see Europe through the prism of the Second World War and post-war period. But today, many young people regularly contemplate not just travelling around Europe to broaden their horizons, but also to work and gain skills. Over 15,000 UK students spent up to a year in another European country during the 2013-14 academic year, up 115% since 2007. And who can blame them? With the prospect of spending more than 50,000 in 3 years in the UK, enrolling in other European institutions offers a cheaper alternative. The majority of courses at universities in Austria, Finland, and Sweden are free. To study in Belgium, you're required to pay €840 annually. In Portugal, the figure is €1,250 each year. In the Netherlands, expect to pay €1,950. But it's not just students, but also British workers, with 2 million UK nationals living and working within the EU. According to the House of Commons Library, by 2025, 500,000 people could have emigrated from the EU, from Britain to the EU. It used to be the Alvezen pet generation of UK construction workers looking for work in the EU, but it's now young computer programmers and students who are looking in the EU to build up their skills base. Those people will then return to the UK and have a huge benefit to our economy. And it is a two-way street. EU students at UK universities generate £3.7 billion for the UK economy and support over 34,000 jobs in all corners of the country, according to the latest analysis from Universities UK. The opportunities for the next generation to engage and improve their skills via their increased interaction with our European neighbours is one of these positive interactions that our country makes as part of the EU. And when they return home, they have a positive effect on our economy. It comes as no surprise that younger people rightly see the EU positively as a land of opportunities. This new ultra-mobile generation enjoy working, travelling and studying in Europe. It's an opportunity that past generations never had available to them to the same extent. But it's for them that we need to fight to make sure we remain within the EU. This generation also, and increasingly mine, has become to understand the threat of climate change. And they too understand that to tackle climate change requires international cooperation, and it starts with membership of the EU. I'll just take one pressing example of an environmental issue that has hit the headlines in the recent mayoral elections, and that's of mounting concern now, and it's air pollution. The concern around air pollution is a good example of the positive influence of the EU making on our day-to-day lives. In the 1970s, the UK was known as the dirty man of Europe because but the EU stepped in and set up strong EU-wide targets on air pollution and nitrogen dioxide levels. My constituency, which includes the airport, has some of the worst polluted air in our country, so I know how big a problem air pollution is for Londoners. So to the shame of this government, we continue to breach these targets today. The Tories have had such a bad record on air pollution that an environmental law firm, Client Earth, have taken the government to court for breaching EU targets. A great example of the EU holding this government to account for the benefit of our citizens. Let me turn now also to the issue of the refugee crisis. It's the ongoing refugee crisis that should act as a spare to action for all of us. The images last summer of dead Syrian children like Alan Kurdi on the beaches of Europe shocked us all to the core. Humanitarian crises on our doorstep warrant a large-scale, coordinated response. And the EU has served as the vital vehicle for securing agreement to cooperation and a coordinated, compassionate response. We must not allow the right in this country and elsewhere to undermine this desperately needed call to assist those in dire need. If you want a compassionate approach to refugees fleeing war zones, then now is not the time to dilute our influence on Europe or further strengthen the right in our country. So for me, it's vital to be in the EU if you want to positively engage with the refugee crisis, tackle climate change, clamp down on tax avoidance and protect our jobs and rights at work, and develop a fair and prosperous economy. But of course, an organisation 28 members strong is not perfect, Far from it. So the EU is in need of thoroughgoing transformation, and that's why Labour is campaigning to remain but reform the EU. And I can further understand why some on the left in particular are frustrated at the role of the EU, particularly with regard to the way in which the Greek people were treated. However, it's true that despite these problems, reform is on the agenda. We can and must do better now and in the future. Right the way across Europe, from Germany to Greece and from Italy to Spain, working people are seriously questioning the European Union's democratic institutions and their operation. Many of these institutions hold meetings behind closed doors, which involve unelected bureaucrats or politicians who are closed off from the struggles of everyday life. But if we think to protect our sovereignty by pretending these meetings won't still be taking place in the event of a Tory Brexit, or that they still won't affect us, then we're only kidding ourselves. As under Tory Brexit, these meetings will simply be replaced by trade deals, which we all know will also be negotiated behind closed doors. And right now in the EU, the Tories are voting against tax avoidance measures and blocking measures to protect steelworkers' jobs when they think we aren't watching. Likewise, we won't be helping our democracy by continuing, as George Osborne wishes, for these meetings to carry on being kept in secret for the rest of us under a Tory Remain vote. That's why I support a reformed Europe under a Labour Remain vote. And yes, there is a big difference. Because when I talk about EU reform, I don't mean the sort of ridiculous deals, the one struck by the Prime Minister to undermine workers' rights in this country. I want to see a more open and transparent EU by ending the secrecy that happens at European Council and ECOFIN conferences. I want the clear light of day to act as a detergent that will rid the EU of some of the most anti-democratic structures. And now more than any other time in recent years, there's a growing coalition right the way across Europe who share this desire and who need our solidarity so we prevent the scenes happening again we saw in Greece and across the EU. Rather than leaving, we should instead stay to make this positive case. And those of us who truly want to strengthen our sovereignty will be passing up this huge chance by voting to leave next month. What we see time and time again is that the problems facing our country are not imported from the EU, but are created by a Tory government. For example, that's why is it we cannot achieve credible reform at the moment? It's because the Tories have sidelined themselves in the European Parliament by joining a separatist right-wing grouping. By doing this, they've helped diminish the UK's influence within the EU. Why have many of the world's leading institutions put our economy on watch? Because the Tory leadership needed this referendum not for our country, but for their own backbenchers. The EU, the UK should be taking a lead in Europe. Instead, you've seen the embarrassing spectacle of a British Prime Minister touring Europe not for an EU deal on tax avoidance, not for an EU-wide deal to deal with the advantages of our steel or manufacturing sector, but for a cheap attack on in-work benefits for a handful of low-paid people, just so they can pretend to be tough on immigration. And when it came to bankers' bonuses, the Chancellor jumped on a train to Brussels to defend their rights. And when it came to steel, he went missing. When it came to tax avoidance, he instructed his MEPs to oppose measures to clamp down on it. The problem for our country isn't Europe. The problem is the Conservative Party. And we cannot let them ruin it for the rest of us, because there's a civil war in the Tory party. We need Labour and its allies across Europe to fight for the reforms that will benefit working people right the way across the continent. If the Tories can fight for bankers' bonuses and sweetheart deals for big business or block measures to tackle avoidance, if they can get deals to benefit their friends in the city who fund their party while cutting deals to restrict benefits to the low-paid few, imagine what Labour can achieve for the many. When we go back into government, we'll go in to fight for working people of our country, not for the benefits of a rich elite. We'll use the levers available in the EU to protect our steel industry from cheap Chinese steel. We'll instruct our MEPs to vote in the European Parliament on measures to help clamp down on tax avoidance by multinationals and the super rich. Labour would use the EU to give power to the British people and stand up to bullying multinationals, not cut us off and expose us to its very worst. I want to end by saying that, yes, there are plenty of things to fear from a Tory Brexit, but there are more positives under a Labour Remain. You can trust remaining in the EU under Labour, as we know how to achieve reforms, the reforms needed, and where there's limits to our relationship with the EU as well. I'll just give the example. One of the few things that Gordon Brown and I agreed upon on the economy was that it was vital for Labour to be kept out of adopting the euro, and we prevented that from happening. And if we hadn't done this, it would have meant that when the global financial crisis hit our economy, we'd have not had a floating exchange rate or independent monetary policy. Due to this decision by the Labour Party, it meant in dealing with the crisis, we were better placed than we could have been. It's an example how you can trust Labour in government to keep the UK safe in the EU. And what's more, under a Jeremy Corbyn Labour government, you can trust us in Europe. As the Leave campaign like to remind everyone of the voting records of Jeremy Corbyn and me, let me help them a bit. It shows that we're prepared to stand up for what we believe in. And on the EU, it shows we clearly don't agree with it on everything or without reform. Whereas a Tory Brexit opens the door to the prospects of more austerity, more uncertainty. It's a future that's more complex and unpredictable than the new voting system of the Eurovision Song Contest. Whereas there are plenty more things you can be certain to look forward to under remaining in the EU under a Labour government, Labour under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn has a different vision for Europe. One where we protect and advance workers' rights. We take on the tax avoiders. We get to grips with climate change. And we protect our industries like steel. And yes, we reform the institutions of the EU from a position of strength as a Labour Party in the EU. So that's why I'll be campaigning wholeheartedly for the UK to be stronger in the European Union under a Labour government. Thank you very much.